Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my hidden gems for Week 4 of the 2020 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about the snap that occurred last night on Thursday Night Football between the Denver Broncos and New York Jets. Sure, we were able to get great performances out of players like Melvin Gordon, a breakout performance out of Tim Patrick, and the resurgence and return from injury from Jamison Crowder. But the snap that occurred last night on Thursday Night Football exploded this energy throughout the multiverse that not only knocked players out of our lineups for this upcoming week, for many weeks to come. Michael Thomas will be missing again, AJ Brown, Chris Godwin. These are great wide receivers and players that are going to continue to miss weeks. There's even a game this week between the Tennessee Titans and Pittsburgh Steelers that will not be taking place because of the snap. So what are we going to do to be able to mitigate this entire issue with our lineups? Because again, we're trying to win every single week in order to get us closer to capturing a 2020 fantasy football championship. So on today's episode, I'm going to be talking about my 6 hidden gems scattered across the multiverse, players that are owned in less than 50% of fantasy leagues that can be put into your lineup and potentially help you guys win here in week 4. So we'll talk about 6 different sleepers that, in my opinion, have great matchups. I'll talk about stats and giving you guys my perspective as to why these guys should not only be rostered for this week potentially, and maybe even started this week, but these are guys that could potentially help you as the season progresses, because there's a lot of injuries taking place, and these players could eventually catch fire here in week 4 and continue that streak. So before we begin, I want to go ahead and thank you guys for the incredible support. If you have not yet already, click that subscribe button, join the community. We're going to be making fantasy football content here on the daily for the entirety of the 2020 fantasy football season, so make sure you go ahead and do that. Outside of that, for those of you who are looking to try to find more content from myself, you can go down below in the description of the video, patreon.com/Andrew Kirchhoff. All the information and extra content is described down below in the description of the video. Regardless, timestamps down there as well. All right, so without further ado, let's start talking about my hidden gems for week 4. Again, these are players that are owned in less than 50% of Yahoo leagues at this current moment in time. Jeff Wilson Jr. is our power stone. We're going to travel to Xandar, aka San Francisco, to collect Jeff Wilson Jr., a running back that as of right now is only owned in 35% of Yahoo leagues. Now, the value of a San Francisco 49er running back is something that a lot of people just don't really take into account. The fact that Jeff Wilson Jr. is still available after the week in performance he had in week 3 is kind of surprising to me. Now, we all know Raheem Mostert dealt with that MCL sprain. Tevin Coleman's on the IR with a knee injury. And the only 2 active backs that are getting majority of the touches out of the San Francisco 49er backfield are Jerick McKinnon and Jeff Wilson Jr. Now, I understand Jeff Wilson Jr. is the second back in this backfield, but let's take into account how many points San Francisco 49ers running backs have put up in each of the last 3 weeks. In week 1, the running back position put up 37.9 points between Tevin Coleman, Raheem Mostert, and Jerick McKinnon. In week 2, the running back position for the 49ers produced 36.7 points. And in week 3, 37.9 points once again. This is in a half PPR scoring format. The running back position for the 49ers is always going to score and is always going to be relevant. So let's take into account why is it that Jeff Wilson Jr. isn't being grabbed up or potentially even played going into this week. And I know a lot of people are assuming that Raheem Mostert is going to 100% come back next week, but there's always a potential that he ends up re-injuring himself or straining his knee and MCL even more. There's always a possibility of that. Last week, week 3 against the New York Giants, Jerick McKinnon, though he was the lead back and the starting back and was given that opportunity last week, he had 17 total touches. Jeff Wilson Jr., having only played 30% of the offensive snaps, had 15 total touches, meaning when Jeff Wilson's on the field, he is getting touches and it is going in his direction. Especially with this offense and the fact that last week they didn't have George Kittle, Deebo Samuel, and they were really struggling with Nick Mullins, they still were able to easily be able to plow through the New York Giants defense. This upcoming week, they take on another team that has been struggling heavily, the Philadelphia Eagles. Sure, the Philadelphia Eagles have played pretty well against running backs, against the Washington football team and the Cincinnati Bengals, but let's not take those too much into account, because again, those are 2 offenses that don't have great running games. When we saw what the Rams did to them in week 2, the Philadelphia Eagles were not the best run-stopping defense. In fact, they had 141 rushing yards put on them from the combination of Darrell Henderson, Malcolm Brown, and Cam Akers. And even Darrell Henderson got himself a couple grabs for 40 receiving yards. So again, the running back position can definitely succeed against the Philadelphia Eagles, especially with the amount of talent that the San Francisco 49ers offensive line has. So going into this upcoming week, what do we have potentially coming down the line? Again, Jeff Wilson Jr., with the 15 touches last week, sure, his yards per carry average kind of looked like Jordan Howard last week, but he still scored 2 touchdowns, had himself 3 grabs from 3 targets, 54 receiving yards, and the opportunity is going to be there. So in my eyes, with the potential of having one of these San Francisco 49ers running backs in a very favorable matchup in my eyes, I honestly have a hard time thinking why Jeff Wilson Jr. is still available in many leagues. He's a guy that you could easily start in your flex position this week, again, with all these players out, or if you're in need of a running back, you don't have James Conner or Derrick Henry this upcoming week, or you're worried about Chris Carson and you weren't able to grab Carlos Hyde. This is not a bad option for you going into this upcoming week and potentially for the future. So Jeff Wilson Jr. is our power stone. We'll go ahead and move on to our space stone here for week 4 of the 2020 fantasy football season. It is Ryan Fitzmagic. Ryan Fitzpatrick, the beard always is going to deliver. Now, Ryan Fitzpatrick has been absolutely incredible in the past 2 weeks, but this isn't a surprise. From weeks 10 through 17 of last year, Ryan Fitzpatrick was one of the best fantasy quarterbacks in a 6 and 4 point per passing touchdown format. It didn't really matter. And he's kind of gotten back on pace this season. Now, week 1 definitely didn't, give Ryan Fitzpatrick the best look. Obviously, they didn't have a preseason. He came out, he played against Bill Belichick and that tough secondary, and he didn't play well. But in the past 2 weeks against the Jacksonville Jaguars and against the Buffalo Bills, Ryan Fitzpatrick has been a fantastic quarterback. Against the Buffalo Bills, had 328 passing yards, 2 passing touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 12 rushing yards. This past week, in week 3 against the Jacksonville Jaguars on Thursday night, had 160 passing yards, 18 for 20 passing, 2 passing touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 38 rushing yards, and a rushing touchdown. He's been absolutely incredible in fantasy, and a lot of people who are in need of a quarterback this week should look in the direction of Ryan Fitzpatrick. He's only owned in 19% of leagues, and he has one of the easiest matchups on hand this upcoming week. With his receiving core fully healthy now, with Devontae Parker back, I expect Ryan Fitzpatrick and this Miami Dolphins-led offense against the Seattle Seahawks, which will be missing Jamal Adams, to have a pretty good opportunity of scoring a lot of points. Again, let's not forget, the Seattle Seahawks are giving up the second most points to opposing quarterbacks thus far this season in a 4-point per passing touchdown format because they've been in shootouts. Russell Wilson has had to throw 14 touchdowns in the last 3 games because unless he didn't do that, they were going to lose majority of those contests because they are getting torched defensively. Their secondary has not played well, and though they're causing turnovers, they're still giving up a lot of yards. On average, the 3 quarterbacks they've played this season, Matt Ryan, Dak Prescott, and Cam Newton, those 3 quarterbacks have averaged 440 passing yards against the Seattle Seahawks thus far this season. They're giving up a lot of yards through the air, and wide receivers are having a field day against them. And from what we've seen Ryan Fitzpatrick do in the past 2 weeks, I think he's going to continue to build on it. Again, a lot of people want to see Tua Tagovailoa play, but the fact of the matter is that Ryan Fitzpatrick's still out there like a gunslinger, getting the job done. So as of right now, Ryan Fitzpatrick is a space stone. He's going to be slinging the rock, so he should be a pretty good play this week. We move on to our next hidden gem. Again, I always got to throw up the Ryan Fitzmagic look after that Tampa Bay game. It's too funny. Anyway, our next play going into this upcoming week and our next hidden gem is the reality stone. Now, the reality of the situation for the Green Bay Packers is that Allen Lazard had core muscle surgery earlier this week and is probably going to be out until maybe week 7 or 8, depending on his progression coming back from said surgery. So what exactly does that do? It gives Marquez Valdes-Scantling, the new number 2 wide receiver of this Green Bay Packers offense, an incredible opportunity to be able to step forward and grab himself extra targets and potentially succeed in some of these pretty good matchups coming forward for the Green Bay Packers. Now, Green Bay Packers do have a bye week next week, but this upcoming week, they take on the Atlanta Falcons. Now, here's the thing about Marquez Valdes-Scantling. The fact of the matter is, being the number 2 wide receiver of the Green Bay Packers offense is always going to have value. Earlier this year, week 1, had himself a pretty good game, 6 catches, 4 receptions, 96 receiving yards, and a touchdown. A pretty decent game, but since then has kind of slowed down as Allen Lazard has stepped up as their team's number 2 wide receiver, or potentially even last week, the number 1 wide receiver when Devontae Adams was out. Now, this upcoming week, like I mentioned, they play against the Atlanta Falcons. A.J. Terrell, who is on the COVID-19 list, will probably be out for 3 weeks because that is how the COVID-19 list works. And Darqueze Dennard is out, their other cornerback. They are very thin in the secondary. They have already been giving up the 3rd most points to opposing wide receivers thus far this season. And this upcoming week with Aaron Rodgers as well as he's been playing, Monday Night Football, I expect this Atlanta Falcons secondary to get torched. And I expect Marquez Valdes-Scantling, with the reality of the current situation, with the potential of even Devontae Adams missing, to step up. I mean, last week, Marquez Valdes-Scantling played 92% of the offensive snaps. He's going to be on the field. The opportunities are going to come in his direction, and he's going to act upon it. Let's not forget, the Atlanta Falcons secondary has given up 5 90-plus yard receivers thus far this season. So again, every single week they are giving up a lot of yards to receivers, and it's not going to be an accident if in fact Marquez Valdes-Scantling find himself in the end zone this week in a very favorable matchup as our reality stone. So with that being said, we'll put Marquez Valdes-Scantling up in the corner, and we'll move on to our next hidden gem for this upcoming week. It's Scotty Miller. Now, as we all know, when we travel to Vormir to collect the Soul Stone, we have to make a sacrifice. This upcoming week, obviously due to the snap, Chris Godwin was our sacrifice. Chris Godwin will be missing at least 2 weeks with the hamstring injury that he has sustained. And though it is something that has plagued him even last season, it is unfortunate, but we need to look for other wide receivers to step up in this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense. Of course, the running back situation with Leonard Fournette being out automatically shifts to Ronald Jones. With Chris Godwin going out, who exactly benefits from this? Of course, Mike Evans is going to get his targets, but there needs to be another receiving option within this Tampa Bay Buccaneers offense for them to function properly in order to give Tom Brady more of an opportunity for success. As of right now, Scotty Miller is that option. The fact that Scotty Miller is only owned in 16% of fantasy leagues right now is not really a surprise, because Scotty Miller's kind of screwed a couple people over already this season when Chris Godwin was out in week 2 due to the concussion. So this coming week, there's a very good opportunity, of course, because of the fact that Chris Godwin is out and Scotty Miller is going to get an uptick in opportunity in the amount of snap counts that he's going to play. The fact that Justin Watson didn't play at all last week. And sure, Scotty Miller is dealing with an injury right now, but earlier today, Friday, he had a full practice and he is likely going to play. As of right now, he is the slot receiver of this team. Last week, 5 targets, 3 receptions for 83 yards. And I think, of course, the Los Angeles Chargers defense is great. Desmond King is probably going to play that slot corner role, and it's going to be difficult for Tom Brady to be able to pass the ball against them. But I expect Scotty Miller to find himself open again. Tom Brady still got that talent. He's still got the arm strength, so he's going to be able to deliver the ball. It's a matter of whether or not Scotty Miller is going to step up to the opportunity on hand. He's had many opportunities thus far this season, and none bigger than this upcoming week in a very difficult matchup against a defense that matches up very well with their receiver talent. So I think Scotty Miller this week, a very, very sneaky play. But again, I wouldn't be surprised if Brady found, other receiving options in a Gronk or an O.J. Howard. But I think that is only going to open up more opportunity for Scotty Miller this week. He is our soul stone for this week. We move on to our next hidden gem. It is Hunter Renfrow, wide receiver of the Las Vegas Raiders. Now, going into week 4, Hunter Renfrow is going to be in a very interesting situation. The fact that both Bryan Edwards and Henry Ruggs are both going to be out due to injury kind of puts this Las Vegas Raiders offensive passing attack in the hands of Renfrow and Darren Waller. And sure, there's always a possibility that they can get one of their backs involved in the passing game or get, Zay Jones or Nelson Aguilar involved, but they're not going to rely upon those guys. It's going to be between Waller, but specifically Renfrow. Last week against the New England Patriots, he stepped up. Had himself 9 targets leading to 6 receptions, 84 receiving yards, and a touchdown against a tough secondary. And this upcoming week, the Buffalo Bills, they have a tough secondary as well. But Hunter Renfrow, as of this current moment in time, seems like he is the number 1 receiving option of this team. And when he was the exact same thing last year, from weeks 8 through 17 of the 2019 season, when he was the number 1 receiving option of the Las Vegas Raiders, he was averaging 12.93 fantasy points per game in a half PPR scoring format. We know what he's capable of, and he's definitely going to be in a very advantageous matchup this upcoming week. I've looked at all 14,605 outcomes, and Hunter Renfrow is going to succeed in majority of them this upcoming week. Now, the reason is because the Buffalo Bills cannot stop opposing slot receivers. Thus far this season, they have struggled heavily. Going back to week 1, Jamison Crowder had 7 catches for 115 yards and a touchdown. Week 2, Isaiah Ford had himself 7 catches, 76 yards, no touchdown. But in week 3, Cooper Kupp, another slot receiver that has dominated throughout the National Football League, 9 catches for 107 yards and a touchdown. They've struggled heavily against opposing slot receivers, and there's a reason why I mentioned Hunter Renfrow in the wide receiver video, in the waiver wire video, yet he's still owned in 37% of leagues. Hunter Renfrow is going to be the number 1 receiving option of this team going forward. Had only played 66% of the offensive snaps last week, and that number is only going to increase even though he's a slot receiver. They are going to make sure that their best receiver is on the field at all times. So this upcoming week, in a matchup that is so advantageous, having already proven that he can be the number 1 wide receiver of this Las Vegas Raiders offense, which he did between weeks 8 through 17 of last season, and just this past week in a tough matchup I expect Hunter Renfrow to step up, and it's finally time for him to take the reins of this number one wide receiver position of the Las Vegas Raiders and run away with it. We move on to our next wide receiver, and the last hidden gem for this upcoming week. It's Greg Ward Jr. Now, Greg Ward Jr., similar to all these other wide receivers that we talked about, injuries have taken place to the other wide receivers on these teams. Now, earlier this week, the Philadelphia Eagles had a practice in which only one wide receiver was practicing at all and healthy. It was Greg Ward. Everyone else, think about it. Deshaun Jackson out this week. Alshon Jeffrey out this week. Jalen Reagor out. JJ Arcega-Whiteside, who is still dealt with injury, hasn't done anything since being drafted. John Hightower, what? What are we doing? It is literally Greg Ward Jr. or bust for this receiving core. And as of right now, Greg Ward is only owned in 11% of Yahoo fantasy leagues. Now, last week, Greg Ward Jr. stepped up as the number one wide receiver against the Cincinnati Bengals, having 11 targets, 8 receptions for 72 receiving yards and a touchdown. An incredible game, over 16 fantasy points in a half PPR scoring format. So why can't he do it again? Having played 84% of the offensive snaps last week, he was the number one wide receiver. And as everything continues to fall apart for this Eagles offense, they're going to have to find a receiving option that can be consistent for them. Sure, Zach Ertz is going to be there. Miles Sanders is going to get his catches. But with Goddard out as well, Greg Ward Jr. is going to have to step up against this tough matchup against the San Francisco 49ers. And though the San Francisco 49ers are a great defense, they are still hurting defensively. There's always going to be an opportunity for Carson Wentz to be able to find Greg Ward Jr. and continue to make plays and find some fantasy consistency as the weeks progress. And though they have tough matchups coming forward, I still think the number one wide receiver of any offense in the National Football League is going to find value. I mean, even with, for example, Jamison Crowder last night. Jamison Crowder may be the number one wide receiver of the worst NFL offense, but he still has fantasy value because the opportunity is there. And that's the argument for Greg Ward Jr. The opportunity is going to be there, and I'm cursed with knowledge to understand that as of this upcoming week, there are no other options for this team to go to. Greg Ward Jr. is going to step up. He's going to have himself a great game, and he's going to be a player that for this Philadelphia Eagles team rest of season could be a guy that is going to continue to get himself more and more opportunity because they cannot consistently stay healthy. Regardless, those are our hidden gems for week 4 of the 2020 fantasy football season. We go ahead and we'll review our 6 hidden gems right now. As you can see on screen, I have collected all 6 hidden gems going into week 4 of the 2020 fantasy football season. Yes, they are beautiful. And the gauntlet, the fantasy gauntlet, is finally been completed. Going into this upcoming week, there's a lot of talent to be had. We'll review it right now. With Jeff Wilson Jr. as our Power Stone, Ryan Fitzpatrick as our Space Stone, Marquez Valdes-Scantling as a Reality Stone, Scotty Miller as a Soul Stone, we have ourselves Hunter Renfrow as the Time Stone, and Greg Ward Jr. as our Mind Stone. Thank you everybody for watching. We have finally completed the Fantasy Gauntlet. A lot of people who were familiar with the Fantasy Gauntlet before being an oven mitten. We've upgraded, and hopefully this week's picks are definitely going to pan out. Thank you everybody for watching, and until next time, Sunday morning, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, kick off with Kirchhoff. I'll see you guys. Peace.